In Esther 7 this morning. It's a fairly short chapter. It's only 10 verses, and it's kind of broken down into two sections where it's Esther's plea, where she finally makes that request before the king, and it is where we see what happens. We see Haman's fate. We see how the king reacts. We've seen last week the idea of reversals. Major theme in Esther is that it turns. Everything looks like it can only go one direction and one way, and then God turns it around, but he does so anonymously. He doesn't do it with his name being mentioned. Let me read a quote here on the other day that I think sums this up well. It says, "Though his name is not mentioned in the book, his signature is written all over this work of redemptive grace," meaning God's presence is obviously there. You can't explain what happens in the book without it, and it's provocative in the sense that the right where you'd expect it to be mentioned, it's missing. Everything's kind of been rearranged so not to mention it. So it's a conspicuous absence. It's something you expect to be there, but it's not there. And so we've seen, I just want to remind us as a lot of these themes converge and then we tie together themes here of kind of over the book of Esther, what we're seeing pop up again and again is the idea of fortune, luck, coincidence, chance, those type of things. But really we would call it providence. We would call it the idea that God is working these things together. But it looks like luck. It looks like that it's just the situations have converged in such a way to work out a certain unexpected way. Reversals, we've seen that with Haman, as Haman is trying to bring down Mordecai. He actually honors him, and as he's trying to honor himself, he actually brings himself down. Xerxes or Ahasuerus drinking, that's going to be key in this chapter. I've mentioned that several times, and I'm going to remind us of some verses of that in just a minute. The eunuchs, also key in this chapter. They come in and they interact with the story as in to drive it forward. And it's kind of funny how it comes into play in this chapter, but why I've emphasized that for a long time is so that when we get here, it'll be more obvious to us. Also, the tension between Mordecai the Benjamite and Haman the Agagite. That's kind of why we see, okay, what's going to be the story here? Because otherwise, you don't need to know that Haman's an Agagite. Well, what's the point? It connects back with that history. It connects back with the law and biblical history and what was said, about the Agagites, the Amalekites. That God would blot out their name because of what they had done to Israel, and that Haman is the embodiment of that he still has that hatred of Mordecai, especially in Israel and in general. And then also feasts. This is one I haven't mentioned before, but the beginning is the Feast of Xerxes, then you have the Feast of Esther, and then you're going to have the Feast of Purim. So it kind of separates out the book by feasts a little bit. To remind us last week, Haman had all these plans and that they had been brought down, and he had to honor Mordecai. And even his wife recognized in Esther 6:13 says, if Mordecai, before you have begun to fall, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish origin, literally the seed of the Jews, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. So she's now recognizing and telling her husband, remember they had given her his court, his wise men, his friends, his relatives, his sons, his wife, said, well, why don't you just go ask the king for permission to kill Mordecai? I mean, just hang him tomorrow morning. And so he goes, okay, I'm going to do that. And the king has that conversation with him. There, God is turning all these situations around, and now Haman has to honor Mordecai, and he's totally shamed. And then he's going to the feast with Esther and the king the next night. And so she recognizes that, as one theologian said, history has a pro-Jewish shape to it, that it has a trajectory. God is moving things in a certain direction, and that Israel is going to be central to that plan, in spite of themselves in many cases. But the Lord has chosen Israel, and it has that unique love that He's set on them, and that He's going to work out His plans through them, culminating in the seed. Now it says the seed of the Jews. This goes back, we talked about this a little bit last week, but this goes back all the way to Genesis 3, the promise of the coming seed, that there's this enmity between you and the woman, which is the woman, obviously the word there is feminine, and between your seed, which is plural, and her seed, which is feminine, plural. And then he, now it's a he, singular masculine, shall bruise you on the head, will crush the serpent, and you shall bruise him on the heel. And what we have here with Esther is kind of a test case of that. You have the seed of the woman, you have the seed of the serpent, represented in individuals, represented in Israel and the Amalekites or Agagites, or the Persians that tried to attack Israel. And you see the seed of the woman triumphing over the seed of the serpent, ultimately culminating in this coming one, right, in this time. Genesis 22:17 narrows this down to a he as well. After Abraham has offered Isaac, or has been prevented from offering Isaac as a sacrifice, the angel of the Lord comes and speaks as the Lord himself and says, "Indeed, I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of heaven and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your seed shall possess the gates of his enemies." Now, in the New American Standard, it says "there" or something, but it has a note where it says "his." It's a singular. And so it's boiled down to one individual who represents the whole. And so when Paul says in Galatians 3, by the way, when he says that one seed, that is Christ, is speaking not of a corporate entity alone, but as an individual, he's reading the text fairly. He's reading it in its grammar and its context. But anyway, so even Haman's wife recognizes, if they're of the seed of the Jews, as Mordecai, you've already started to fall before him. You're going to go all the way down as well. And so that's where kind of things left off. And then notice 6:14, who comes in to take Haman on his way to the banquet with the king and queen. The eunuchs come in out of nowhere, and they take him to the banquet, where this should be a good thing for him in a sense. But we also know that we know Esther's identity, which the king doesn't know at that time, neither does Haman. So let me point out the theme here, because this will become important in a second, but we talked about Xerxes drinking. Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, is a man of appetite, right? He's a guy who starts off Esther 1 with this huge party that lasts for several months long and then culminates with a bigger party at the end. And so there's this, he's driven by his appetites. He's driven by doing whatever he wants. He's impulsive. His what he does in the story is he's always, almost always drinking. And remember, after in Esther 3, after the announcement of this decree to annihilate the Jews, he and Haman sit down to drink, and it says the whole city of Susa is in confusion, meaning they're totally oblivious to all the chaos that this decree has caused, and the king is just, sitting back, drinking, just hanging out. Actually, it's funny you guys just walked in. Mrs. Moore and I talked last week. She mentioned that and I think it was a good insight, that Esther's plan to get to Xerxes through his stomach was probably calculated. That she probably planned out to talk to him in language that he would get. That and before she makes her request, lay out, okay, let's have a banquet. Now let's have another banquet. Okay, this is the type of stuff that he identifies with, that he likes. Now we're going to see the drinking theme here, but let me just show you again. Esther 1:7. Drinks were served in golden vessels. Esther 1:8. The drinking was done according to the law. There was no compulsion. 1:10. On the seventh day, the heart of the king was merry with wine. Esther 3:15. Haman, the king and Haman sat down to drink. The city of Susa was in confusion. Esther 5:6. They drank wine at the banquet, this last banquet, and then we're going to see 7:1 and 2 play into this very heavily as well, that this theme is going to continue through the book here. So let's look at verses 1 and 2 and look at Esther's plea. Now the time has come for Esther to make known what her request is actually going to be before the king. As now the king and Haman came to drink wine with Esther the queen. And the king said to Esther on the second day also, as they drank their wine at the banquet, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to half my kingdom it shall be done." So again, the king repeated his assurance to Esther that whatever she asked, in this kind of ancient Near East exaggeration, even to half my kingdom, it will be given to you. I'll do whatever you want. He's guaranteed that whatever she asks will happen. Now, this is going to be a problem because what she asks is for him to somehow reverse an irreversible law. And so he's going to recognize, once she reveals this, that there's a big dilemma facing him. That he's not only endangered his wife through his foolishness, but he has made a decree that was wrong and now can't change it, can't reverse it. And so he's going to have some thinking to do. But the moment had finally come for Esther to intercede and act on behalf of her people. And so let's look at verses 3 through 6. It says, "The queen Esther replied, 'If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me as my petition, and my people as my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Now if we had only been sold as slaves, men and women, I would have remained silent. For the trouble would not be commensurate with the annoyance to the king.' Then King Ahasuerus asked Queen Esther, 'Who is he, and where is he, whom would presume to do this?' Esther said, 'A foe and an enemy is this wicked Haman.' Then Haman became terrified before the king and queen." So now the final reversal against Haman, the final lot, has come up to show that he is now it's really over. What his wife said, without having to be a predictive prophetess, is true. That she recognized the trajectory of biblical history enough to know, as Mordecai, from before whom you've begun to fall, is of the seed of the Jews. You will not overcome him. And now Haman, after being shamed all day long through leading Mordecai on the parade and talking about how honored he is before the king and all this stuff, when he had planned to kill him, now the day finally culminates in a bad way with now the queen has turned against him and said Haman is wicked, an enemy, and a foe. And this hasn't even unfolded yet exactly what she means, right? That she's a Jew, that she is, but it's starting to dawn on them what the truth is. And so she asks her request, if it pleases the king, let my life be given to me as my petition and my people as the request. So she asks just for, let us live. Don't do this ethnic cleansing. Don't do this pogrom. Don't allow this to happen, because this will kill me too, according to the law, and it will kill my people. And notice the use of the idea of slavery there. He says, for we have been sold. Remember, Haman said, I'll offer you a bunch of gold and silver if you kill these people, if you do this. And he basically thought that, okay, after these people are killed, we'll appropriate their possessions, and that will be the payoff for the king. And the king doesn't necessarily care about the money, but he's like, okay, whatever. And the king may not have even been aware that the decree was specifically against the Jews. He just heard there are people in your kingdom whose customs are different, whose laws are different, who are different than us, and it's not going to be good for you. So can you, allow me a decree to do this, and I'll give you a bunch of money? And the king says, fine, and allows Haman his signet ring to go basically craft his own decree in the king's name. And so that's what Haman does. And now the king's realizing that he shouldn't have let Haman do that. But Esther says, we've been sold twice in 7:4. We have been sold. Or she says, if only we had been sold as slaves. Look, that would have taken us back to kind of the Egypt scenario back in the 1400s. He said, if only that had been the situation. She said, I wouldn't bother you. We've been slaves before. I wouldn't bring it up to you as an annoyance. Look, we survived that. But we can't survive this. This is why I have to bring it up. And it's interesting that in Esther's plea, she argues that they're enslaved. And they are, in this sense as well. They are under the dominion of a foreign power. They are in exile. They are not in the land, and even when they return to the land, in Ezra and Nehemiah, with more this return of the people to rebuild the temple and then later to rebuild the walls, they recognize that they're still under exile because they're still under foreign domination. They still don't have all the promises that the prophets promised that were coming. The temple's too small. The temple, it doesn't look like what Ezekiel talked about in Ezekiel 40 through 48, that they're not the head of all nations. They don't have the full geographic borders that were promised to Abraham. So all this stuff is missing. And let me read some sections from the statements or prayers of Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra 9:9 says, for we are slaves, yet in our bondage God has not forsaken us. So they say we're still slaves. Nehemiah 9:36 twice says, behold, we are slaves today. We're not just slaves in the past in Egypt. We're still under that condition of slavery in exile. And again, he says, behold, he's talking about the land. We are slaves in it. Now, they have a lot more freedom. They have a lot more leeway to be able to make decisions a little bit independently. The Persians and later Darius, they're a little bit more loose. Cyrus, Darius, these kind of kings, they're a little bit more loose with the peoples under their control. They don't dominate them as much as they could. They're not like the Babylonians, who are a little bit more harsh with their controlling the minutia. They kind of let people be their own outpost and manage their own affairs. But there's still this tribute-paying, tax-paying situation under which the Jews are not their own people in their own land without the control of a dominant Gentile power, world empire. And this is the case going forward into the time of even Jesus. They're under, at that time, later the Greeks, and then under the Romans, and they're still under that condition of exile. I was talking to some Jews yesterday. I went to a synagogue service yesterday out here in Lancaster, and they were real ethnic Jews, but they were Hasidic Jews. And one of the first things, I talked to this guy named Irving, who was in a wheelchair before the service started. We were outside, waiting for the rabbi and the other people to get there, and we were talking, interacting. I told him, I'm just a visitor. I'm a Christian, and we were just talking. And he goes, and I said, I'm a teacher of the Old Testament, so I'm here just to, interact with you guys and see what your services are like and all that stuff. And so it was fun. You were very nice to me and everything. But Irving, one of the first things he said to me, he goes, "Well, we're still in exile." And I'm like, "I know." He said, "We're still in exile. Eventually there's going to be a movement back toward that land, but we're under exile now." And I'm like, "Yeah, I know. I agree. I'm right there with you." I said, I have Christian brothers who, we believe a lot of the same things, but they think that, that Israel is not going to take the land. I said, but, Ezekiel says there's going to be a temple there, So we're interacting through the Old Testament, talking about those things. But the first thing that he says is, that true Jews who are religiously orthodox know that they're under exile. They're still under this condition that Esther, talks about as well. That they've been under that condition until the second coming of the Messiah. They don't believe he's come yet, but that's where our difference was. And so anyway, Israel returned to slavery through their commitment to their sin. They begin the Old Testament as a nation in slavery, and they end the Old Testament and into the New Testament as a nation in slavery. And it's really ultimately, the heart of it is slavery to their sin, as we talked about in Ezra and Nehemiah, that they said, they're confessing their sin, but the people cannot escape that and bring the blessings of the law, so all they can bring is the curses of the law. And so Esther in Persia is, making this statement. And the writer of Esther is picking up on the fact that, look, this is the situation that Israel's under. Yet even in that, God is still working. They're still the people of God under that situation. But Israel's slavery would persist. And that's when Jesus, in John 8, would say, he would talk about being slaves. And they're like, well, we haven't ever been slaves to anybody. And Jesus says, well, whoever sins is a slave to sin. It ultimately, he takes it all the way back. It's ultimately about slavery to sin, which is the condition of every human being. And so he takes it back to there. But it's like, well, do you remember Egypt? And, Ezra and Nehemiah were slaves even to this day. Like, you know the Romans? Like, what do you mean you've never been slaves? So anyway, how does the king react? Because now there's this dilemma, this problem, this tension that he has to resolve. Now notice verse 7. Okay, this is where we see kind of the culmination of this point that I've been emphasizing. The king arose in his anger from the drinking of wine, the banquet of wine. And so now he gets up from drinking. His main thing that you'd identify him with, he stops doing. Okay, so now this means it's like there's been a shift, there's been a change now in what's about to happen that's significant. It's that this habit, this normal expectation of what you expect to see with the Ahasuerus now stops abruptly. And he gets up and he's angry. And what does he do? Look at further at verse 7. And he went into the palace garden, but Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm had been determined against him by the king. See, imagine this situation, watching this, that all of a sudden Esther makes this statement, and Haman and Xerxes are sitting there and thinking, what does this mean? Okay, now Haman must have realized Esther's a Jew and that this decree is against her, and then begged, he starts begging for mercy almost immediately. The king stands up abruptly in his anger and just walks out of the room. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation like that, where just someone just all of a sudden gets up and just leaves the room, and then they come back, or something. It's like, and you don't know what's going to happen, right? So it's pretty abrupt here. And so now in the room, there are other people there, but they're not mentioned yet. Now in the room, Haman is just there trying to beg for his life, for some mercy from Esther. Okay, so the king hasn't made a response at all. He's just left and gone into the garden and has to process the information and think about what to do. And so it doesn't mean he's granted, Esther her life yet, but he's also promised that he would do that, whatever she asked. And so now he's got a problem. Okay, now Haman's worst and unexpected nightmare has become a reality. His plan against Mordecai and the Jews has now been a plot and a conspiracy, without him even knowing it, against the queen. And so now Haman unknowingly has plotted his own destruction. And so one more time, providentially, Haman's actions to try to save himself are going to be used to condemn him. Look at verse 8. It says, "Now when the king returned from the palace garden," so now the king has walked out of the room. Haman's getting on his knees. He's doing everything he can to beg for mercy from the queen. And the way I picture this is there's this old actor named Peter Lorre. He's from he plays Igor in what is that movie? Young Frankenstein or something. And he plays but what I think of him is he's in this Humphrey Bogart movie called The Maltese Falcon. And he's just this you have to see him in the movie, but he's just this guy who's always clinging on to people and just I need this. That's what I'm picturing Haman. It's just this whiny guy. He complains. He grabs. He's crying at certain points. He's a really good actor. He's very compelling, but he always kind of plays that kind of slimy. He's a bad guy, but not the main antagonist. Okay, so he plays like Igor or something. He's just this kind of creepy looking guy. But anyway, that's what Haman's doing. He's getting on it. Because imagine if you're all of a sudden, you lose all pretense and you've been told you've committed this conspiracy against this person who's a royal, and the king gets up and leaves the room, and all of a sudden, what else do? You beg for mercy, start crying, drop to your knees, whatever. And that's what Haman is doing. But even in his doing that, that's going to be a big problem for him. That's going to be used to condemn him. Look at verse 8. Now when the king returned, now the king walks back into the room, Haman doesn't know, into the palace garden, the place where they were drinking wine. Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, "Will he even assault the queen with me in the house?" As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Okay, a couple things here. Now, he's laying on the couch "Oh, please, God, no." And, asking her for mercy. But his over zealousness, I guess, his reaction is, he doesn't follow convention anymore. Okay, so now he's touching the queen. He's on the couch with her and all this stuff. All the king comes in and sees is Haman laying on top of his wife on the couch. "Please, oh God." And he thinks, wait a second, is he physically or sexually assaulting my wife? All of us, or trying to do this while I'm here and I left the room? Is he going to do this while I'm in the house? And so he misinterprets Haman's actions as he's trying to either kill her or touch her in a way that's inappropriate or something like that. And so he's like, that's it. You're going to try to kill the queen in my house? And it says, and they covered his face. Who? It's the eunuchs in 7:9. And Harbona, one of the eunuchs who were before the king, said, so where did they come from? All of a sudden, out of nowhere, the eunuchs are here. That I said, they're like coming kind of like the Oompa Loompas after something bad happens. It's like now all of a sudden, they cover his face. Well, who did? Well, the eunuchs. And the eunuchs are going to remind the king of something that they're like, also, he's a bad guy because, and they're going to throw out something else. The eunuchs are kind of like, if in a movie you saw like the Grim Reaper, the guy in the cloak with a scythe or something like this, like a skeleton, show up, that means it's a sign of like death or something, right? That's kind of how the eunuchs are playing in here too. So they come in as that. So Haman gets so desperate, that he does this, but really it kind of seals his fate. If the king may have been, we don't know, coming in thinking, okay, maybe I'll find a way I can get Haman out of this too, grant him some clemency, give him some mercy, or give him at least a chance to explain himself. But, as soon as he sees him on top of his wife and misunderstands what Haman is doing there, he's like, okay, that's it. You're going to try to kill my wife or touch her in my house, then you're dead. And that's what happened. And then the eunuchs, then Harbana, one of the eunuchs who was before the king, look what they say, said, behold, indeed, the gallows standing at Haman's house 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on behalf of the king. So he says, oh yeah, and the guy, remember, that saved your life, the Jew that saved your life, Haman built, it just so happens, he built a gallows outside his own house, 75 feet high, in order to, he wanted to impale Mordecai on that. I don't know how they knew this information. Maybe Haman was talking to other people about it. So he said, so now the king's just been reminded, wait a second, Mordecai was the guy I just threw a parade for and had Haman honor him because he had saved my life 5 years ago. And I had just been reminded of that and realized I didn't do anything for him. And then Haman was going to try to kill him too. And so he's, so they say, okay, he's set up this gallows. And it's funny, I guess I hadn't realized that the gallows is right outside Haman's house, or it's close by, enough to be associated with his residence. And so, and he must have been at least indicating that he hated Mordecai. And so now the king in 7:9, the king says, hang him on it. Okay, that's his final word on Haman, that Haman's now sealed his own fate here. That he's now, everything that he's planned for the good of himself has been to his own destruction. Everything he's planned for the destruction of the Jews has been turned around now on him. And let's notice the type of death that Haman dies. This is significant. This is where Esther expects us to know the Old Testament. Okay? And that may not be totally fair for us because, we're coming to it kind of late, right? But the author of Esther expects us to know, when it mentions Haman's an Agagite, it expects us to pick up on whatever else is going on from previous biblical law and history. And when it mentions that Haman is being hanged, it expects us to understand what that means. This is the God-cursed death. This is a death of hanging impalement that is written in the law and the history of Israel for leaders who are under God's curse, that they take the responsibility for their people and that they are to be hanged to represent, not stoned. That was the normal method of execution for crime. But they were to be hung up. They were to be displayed publicly as a representative of the leadership. They are represented as being under the wrath of God. The first time that this, well, it shows up several times, but I mentioned last week Joseph in Genesis. This is pre-Israel's law. But Joseph interprets the dreams of the cook, the baker, and the other guy in the prison with him. And he says, one of you is going to make it, and the other one is going to be hanged. And that's the idea here of hanging, impalement, of piercing. And this was very common in the ancient Near East. It was what they did to kings and royals when nations went to war against each other. They would, if they got the king, they would hang them up. They would pin them to the wall or something. They would tear apart the body, do all these different things. But they would usually hang it. This was what they did to the bodies of Saul and Jonathan. Is they captured them. They pinned them. They were already dead, but they pinned the bodies to the wall as a display. So this was very common as well. So otherwise, if we don't understand that, Haman's death looks kind of anticlimactic. Look at verse 10. It just says, "So they hanged Haman on the gallows, which was prepared for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided." Okay, but if we understand where Esther fits into biblical law and history, we understand this is like movies do this all the time. You're supposed to pick up on things that were earlier in the movie or in a previous movie. Okay, think about like Star Wars. Okay, in the new Star Wars, when they do this all the time, when they find like somebody else's lightsaber from the past or something, it's like you're supposed to get. Okay, this is pulling in information. The Bible does that all the time too. It's called intertextuality. It's pulling all kinds of information. It expects us to know and understand. For example, like in Judges, when it says, well, everybody did what was right in their own eyes. Well, that goes back to Deuteronomy that says, don't do what is right in your own eyes. Follow God's law. So when Judges starts to say, yeah, this is a time where there's no king and everybody's doing right in their own eyes, it's showing that bad things are going to happen. They're being disobedient to the law. And so when it says here, well, they hanged him on the gallows, the literal word there is tree. So they hanged Haman on the tree, which was prepared for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. And so there's this, you can see the idea of appeasing the king's wrath here as well through Haman and his death. And so we're meant to understand the first time in kind of Israel's history is when Israel, led by its leaders, turns away from God to worship Baal at Baal Peor in Numbers 25. And there's this plague. The wrath of God is coming onto the people. And Moses, appeals to God. What can we do? And God says, hang up all the leaders. Basically, this is the equivalent, not of rope hanging, but this is the equivalent of impale publicly all the leaders. Crucify in the sense before, Roman crucifixion, but this idea of pierce them, hang them up. And then there's one guy who wants to continue this rebellion against the Lord with sexual immorality, and Phinehas hangs him. He impales him, and he pierces him. Those are all similar words in biblical law. And so that's what that story, that narrative, is brought in. Moses explains in Deuteronomy 21, 22, and 23, if there's a man worthy of death, not just in a normal sense, but a leader worthy of death, you are to hang him on a tree. Now in Israel, what this meant was you had to hang them and you had to bury them the same day. So that it represented God's curse, and it represented leadership dying under a God-cursed death, but it also, you had to bury them to show that was the case. This is what they do several times when they come into the land, and they do this in Joshua 8:29 to the king of Ai. They hang him, and then they bury him. They do it in Joshua 10 to, I think, 5 kings. They hang them and then they bury them as they're in the land. Haman doesn't get buried as far as we know, but this isn't in Israel, this is in Persia. And so what the author's having us pick up on is that this man dies under God-cursed death. Notice also, remember that we're told Haman is the Agagite. We read Exodus 17:14, some other passages here. It says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, write this in the book as a memorial and recite it to Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven." Yeah, and yesterday when I was in synagogue, they do the reading and of the, they were doing it in English, thankfully, because otherwise I wouldn't have been able to keep up. But they did, between the prayers, they did the reading. And they were reading from Exodus 17. So they went around and asked different people to read. They asked me to read. I'm like, is that okay? They were like, yeah. I'm like, okay. So I read all of Exodus 17, which was this passage. So I was able to interact with the rabbi afterward about Esther. And I asked him about this. And I said, look, is this a legitimate, in your mind, because I know it is from the text and the words and the grammar, but is this a legitimate application? Did Haman, by being hanged, die under God's curse? Yeah, and he agreed with that. He said that was probably the case. That God's not mentioned in Esther, but that's on purpose. It's kind of a hidden thing. So we were on the same wavelength as far as that. But anyway, 1 Samuel 15:1-3, and Samuel said to Saul, this is years later, at the end of the era of the judges, beginning of the era of the kings, it says, "Then the Lord sent me to anoint you as his king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore, listen to the words of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel, how he set himself against him on the way while he was coming up from Egypt. Now go and strike Amalek and utterly destroy all that he has, and do not spare him, but put to death both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." So God had previously cursed the Amalekites for what they did to the Israelites coming out of Egypt. Agag was their king, and the author of Esther points out, he doesn't point out that Xerxes is a Persian, or that what the ethnic background is of every single character. But he points out, and there were a lot of people in Persia, but he points out specifically that Haman's an Agagite. That only makes sense if we're taking from previous scripture, that these are people who previously had been against Israel, had cursed Israel, and had tried to destroy Israel on their way, and that this animosity against Israel had continued into their own time and into Haman. It's not like Haman's like, what my people did in the past is not me, and I separate myself from that and live my life peacefully and all these other things. That would have been one thing, but Haman actually embodies that. He follows through on that. He hates Mordecai not only because he's a Jew, but because he's a Benjamite, and that Saul and Agag had this, that Saul had failed to kill him, and now Haman thinks that because I'm an Agagite and the Jews are in exile, our history's been reversed, and now my clan is on top. Now I am the one who's in charge, and I'm going to get Mordecai to bow to me or to serve me. And so he can't, when he can't get him to do that, he wants to kill not only Mordecai, but all of Mordecai's people. And so the author mentions that this is, Haman's ancestry for this reason. Haman and Agagite were meant to understand, okay, this is a test case of what God has stated in history about Israel and about the Agagites, the Amalekites, the enemies of Israel. Will it work out in real history, even when Israel's under exile? We read a quote here from a book on Esther specifically. It says, "This is not," speaking of an Agagite, "this is not an ethnic designation that would make any real sense in the Persian Empire." Meaning they didn't care in the Persian Empire who an Agagite was or what that meant. It says, "By so identifying Haman, the Masoretic text of Esther makes a clear connection between Haman and the Amalekite king Agag, mentioned in 1 Samuel 15:8, thereby confirming the connection between Mordecai and King Saul hinted at in Esther 2:5. and establishing the continuation of an ancient enmity between the two characters. Meaning, this is still alive and well in Mordecai and his people and Haman and his people. And we're going to see a test of which side will win. And this is kind of like a science test. A science test is where you have variables that you try to keep on the same. You have a control, and then you have one that you think you're going to bring in something that is going to be the thing that changes that, called the independent variable. Meaning you have everything you try to keep as the same. The independent variable is God's action in these different things. That God is the one who is changing and deciding what will be the case in history. Not only has he stated it in the past, not only has he decreed it, but he actually brings it to pass. And Esther is a test case representing that is the case. That what God has said will pan out, will unfold in actual history. And you've got to think about Esther as following Daniel. Daniel said, okay, here's going to be the trajectory of these 4 major kingdoms, and then the 5th one, there will be others, but there's 4 worth mentioning, and then the 5th one is the ultimate one, the kingdom of God on earth. And here's going to be the suffering of the saints, in between this time, all this stuff. And so this is all laid out, and then Esther comes in to the story. The Jews are still in exile. They're still disobedient. They're still slaves. They're still is this really the case? Now the Babylonian lion has gone off the scene, and it's the Persian bear, according to Daniel 7:5. And now it's the Persian Empire. Now, is this going to be the one that really conquers the Jews? Maybe Daniel was wrong. We know he wasn't, but if you're living under these circumstances, you have to start to wonder. And so this Esther shows that that's not the case. It gives us this interpretive clue that goes all the way back to Genesis 12, the promise to Abraham, the Abrahamic covenant. Genesis 12:3 says, "And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." And so this is what God has established. I will bless those who bless you. Those who do not bless you are under that curse. That salvation is going to be of the Jews, as we've been hearing in Sunday morning. And in you all the families, meaning this is not just the Gentile nations. This is down to specific families, will be blessed. Will have that blessing. And we have the fulfillment partially of that now as Gentile believers. So the Abrahamic covenant has stated this, and the promises still hold, even while Israel is in exile. Also yesterday I met a friend named Solomon. I talked to him. He's 33, younger guy. And we were interacting. He asked, is it really true that if you accept Jesus, it doesn't matter what you did, all your sins will be forgiven? I'm like, yeah. And we're interacting about of course he was like trying to say, well, what if you're bad? And I was trying to bring in, repentance and talking terms he understood. But I went back. I got it from Romans 4, but I didn't tell him that. But he asked, well, what if you're a murderer? And I was like, well, what about like David? What about Psalm 32? Or I said, for you, maybe 33, because they have different numbers. And I said, well, that how blessed is the man whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered, and to whom the Lord does not impute iniquity. And I said, impute means to legally assign guilt. I said, so God forgave David's sin. And then I went to Genesis 15:6, and I said, before Abraham circumcised, he has faith, and he believes, and God reckoned that to him as righteousness. So I was like, fine, we'll talk in the Old Testament. And so, pointing that out here, that in you all the families of the earth will be blessed, that's being fulfilled now. I mean, that's unfolding now. And so we see Haman's line is cursed by God. We see that he has settled himself as an enemy of God by being an enemy of the people of God. And so the text demonstrates this hermeneutical dependence, meaning it looks back, it wants us to understand there's a foundation that comes before this. And so the meaning of the text is simply that Haman's executed this way. The significance of the text is we're supposed to pick up on the fact that Haman's execution in that way, being hanged on a tree, is under God's wrath, is under God's curse that was inescapable for him. So the intention of the biblical authors is not just that we understand what happened, but why it happened. Let me finish up with this quote here. This is from Abner Chow, who writes on, he wrote his dissertation on Deuteronomy 21, 22, and 23, which is cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree, and how that unfolds through the rest of the Bible. He writes here, the writer of Esther correctly interprets and applies Deuteronomy 21, 22, and 23 with the events of the narrative. Initially, the stipulation of the ultimate sin is clearly in view. Amalek, as a nation, has committed a massive offense against the nation of Israel when they came out of Egypt. Even more, Haman, his family, and others who complied with this plot against the Jews were clearly attempting to continue to curse Israel. All those factors not only constitute a serious sin committed by a corporate entity, but also warrant a curse of condemnation. So far, the circumstances match between the situation in Esther and the situation in Deuteronomy 21, 22, and 23, as well as the application begun in Numbers 25:4. That's the hang all the leaders passage. It says, the narrator portrays the hanging of Haman and his son, completes a larger story of God's curse against the Amalekites. So God completes the satisfaction of his curse against his enemies in the punishment of their leaders. And so that's what Esther's picking up on there in Haman's death, that while Haman tried to curse Israel, God turned around the curse on him, fulfilling Genesis 12:3, I will bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you. Now for us, just like it always has been, salvation is of the Jews. It stands or falls with Israel. But for us, that means Israel embodied in the Messiah. Israel embodied in one individual, in Christ. And so we now, it stands or falls with what people will do with Christ. Whether they will bless him or curse him is what will be the result of God's judgment on their lives. And so this is laying out the way history works. And Esther is showing that God can turn all these things around. So let's close with a word of prayer here and then go to worship. Lord God, we thank you for your word. We thank you that we can see how you've worked so clearly and vividly throughout history, but how you can even hide yourself and hide your name in the details. Even when it is obvious that you are at work, that your name is not mentioned, and that this is another way that you glorify yourself. Lord, we pray for your honor and glory in these things. In Jesus' name, amen.